Greetings and welcome to the history of Los Angeles. I'd like to talk about the environment to kick things off, and the theme of this discussion is that the environment shaped the history of the region. We can begin with the landscape of Southern California, which begins at the Tehachapi Mountains and stretches all the way down to below what is today San Diego. As Carrie McWilliams notes, these mountains really divide Southern California from the central area of the state and the north, and they create a very different kind of environment to this region. There are three main features of the Los Angeles region. There's what are called the transverse mountains, there's the Los Angeles basin, and there's the desert. And the Los Angeles basin is part of this arid environment that makes up so much of Los Angeles. As Carrie McWilliams said, Los Angeles is a paradox. It's a desert that faces an ocean. And if we think about an area that could support a population of hundreds of thousands of people, it might be, or seem today, a bit like a desert, but it could certainly be much more than that. And the region is much more than that. Let's begin with the transverse mountains. Something that's very unusual about these mountains is that unlike major mountain ranges in most of the rest of the country, they don't go north and south. They go east and west. That's why they're transverse. And that means they're the Santa Monica and the San Gabriel mountains to the north, and the San Bernardino and San Jacinto mountains to the east. And most of these mountains are relatively young. They're only a few million years old, but the rock inside the mountains is much older. In the San Gabriel Mountains, the rocks are over 1 billion years old. And what these transverse mountains provide is a kind of barrier, a protective zone to the area of what is now Southern California, and that enabled a very particular kind of ecosystem to develop and even thrive in this area. The mountains, on the one hand, hold in the moisture. And so those ocean breezes coming in off of the Pacific Ocean gets trapped by the transverse mountains. We can also think of those mountains as a kind of barrier to prevent invasion from other tribes coming into the area over thousands of years. So in that sense, a kind of protection for those who lived here. If you have the melting snow from the north, the rivers that come down and create moisture and abundance of life, it would be impossible to imagine the history of this region without a history of its rivers. You have three main trees or tree forms in this area: the pine, and the maple, and the oak. These are indigenous. Almost everything else you see has been brought in from outside. You also have chaparral covering the mountains and providing a kind of anchoring of a very rocky and shifting soil. And those trees, that environment, provided the foundation for supporting Indian tribes here for thousands of years. Think of the acorns. Think of the use of reeds for huts. Think of the wood to create canoes, to fish in the ocean and on the rivers. And so the environment shaped the history. Let's talk a little bit more about what some of these areas looked like. Think of the Los Angeles basin, which is largely flat, although it's on a slight incline that stretches down into what is today Long Beach and San Pedro. And that is mainly sand, where oceans billions of years ago used to be, and also volcanic material. And the top of it is a sediment that was carried down from the mountains. That sediment is important because it provided a means of plant life, which would have helped to support the populations. So it's a relatively fertile soil, which is perfect for agriculture, even though Indian tribes in this area did not engage in much agriculture, but they certainly engaged in the capture of game and the use of acorns and the coastal areas. Coursing through this basin are two main rivers, the Los Angeles River and the San Gabriel River. And without those two rivers, it's almost impossible to imagine life in this particular area over thousands of years. They assured the fertility of the valley for much of its existence. And for much of its existence, this basin area was actually a kind of wetlands, which supported a far more abundant lives, crops and plants and so on than we see today. Around 1825, there were torrential rains which changed the course of the Los Angeles River, and the basin began to dry up more. And so today it's rather arid and less friendly to life than it once was, but can still support an abundance of crops. And then going along that Los Angeles basin is the coastal region. And to imagine Southern California without the coast is almost impossible. That coast provided life, shellfish, and sea animals and food for thousands of years, and was essential to life in the area. The environment shaped the history. If you go further down that coastal region and you go underneath, you would find oil. Oil is the product of microorganisms building up over hundreds of millions of years and creating eventually these pockets that Indians could use for tamping up their canoes or use for their huts, long before oil became important for more commercial reasons. And then there's the desert. This is the southwestern part of the Mojave Desert. And that is one of the largest desert regions in the country. Today it's part of Antelope Valley, and it's largely cut off from the rest of Los Angeles County. And here you find yucca trees. The largest by far are the Joshua trees, an important source of food, but also the mesquite plant, which was the basis for subsistence for tribes who lived there. And think of the climate. That climate that has brought so many people to this region over so many years was also precisely the climate that could help support life. And it's remarkably predictable. As Carrie McWilliams tells us, the climate is the region. There's sunshine for much of the year, two major seasons, spring and summer, separated by a rainy season. But when that rainy season comes in between January and March, it's often torrential. And then a slight spring, and then summer. And then come those Santa Ana winds. And we know about those Santa Ana winds, how they can dry up the area and create enormous dangers. Because part of the lifestyle of this region is precisely its unpredictability. That earthquakes are just as much a part of the history of this region as the climate. And this is the San Andreas Fault, which consists of two plates moving against each other, crisscrossing much of California all the way up to San Francisco. And those plates are the reason for the transverse mountains, which are moving at a rate of about 2 inches a year. So estimated in perhaps 10 million years, Los Angeles will pass San Francisco. And these rivers that are constantly shifting and erratic with occasional flooding meant that you have this curious environment of hot, dry summers, often rainy winters when there's not a drought, mixed with the Santa Ana winds, and on occasion, the earthquakes. And so the product of this can at once be what seems on the surface to be a kind of Eden, a kind of paradise, but also can prove to be quite deadly, with devastating effects for life in this area.